I am Dial Lucas and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He is the author of the book Diabetes Book, What Everyone Should Know. No other than Mr.Chet Lagasca.
Great. Well, thank you for having me.
Welcome to Book 101, Mr. Chet, and can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. At the moment, I'm 72 years old. I'm retired. I've been married for 48 years. I've got two sons, two daughters-in-law, and three grandchildren. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes back in 1981. So I've had it for over 40 years. My background as far as business goes is that I co-founded a company back in 1979. I sold my interest a number of years later. And since that time, I've understood how poorly diabetes is understood by the general public and by many diabetics. So I decided to try to tackle that problem. I've written a couple of books, developed a diabetes education program that I've presented to a lot of different groups in cooperation with the local medical center, University of Massachusetts, Springfield College, and various other groups. So I've got a lot of hands-on experience in knowing about diabetes, understanding what other people are up against, and understanding how poorly many people understand it. I was doing the classes until COVID, and when that happened, everything blew up. Nobody was meeting anymore. So for about 3 years, I wasn't doing anything with the program. But during that time, podcasts became popular, and I realized that I could reach a lot more people doing podcasts than I ever could doing groups of 15 or 20 people at a time. So I've been doing the podcast for over a year now, and it's been a really good experience. I know I've reached lots of people. I also developed a video, which actually is two videos that I've developed over the past year, and I've got those available. I'm hoping that people will use them to show to groups, because if a group watches these videos and then discusses it, there will be a great awakening among people about this disease. So that's really what I'm hoping for.
Congratulations, Mr. Chet, for your book and your podcast to empower people out there to know what is diabetes is. So what are the causes of diabetes?
We don't really know. This is one of the misconceptions that's out there. People think that people get type 2 diabetes because they're overweight, or they ate too much sugar, or they were sedentary. And those things do not cause diabetes. They're important in dealing with it once you have it, but they are not the underlying cause. With both type 1 and type 2, they start when a genetic predisposition encounters something in the environment that triggers it. You have no control over that. You can't control your genes, and we don't know what the triggers are. It could be that they're different for everybody. So these aren't things that you can avoid in any way, shape, or form. And this is important because there's a stigma about diabetes, because people do think that diabetics brought it on themselves, and if they just lost some weight, or they would stop eating sugar or whatever, that it would go away. And it's just not that way. So that's probably the biggest misconception. And that's something that I ran into in my classes, where I would have people come up to me after the class was over and tell me that the best thing I told them is that they weren't at fault for getting the disease, because they've been walking around feeling guilty and ashamed because they thought they brought it on themselves also. So it's really a gratifying moment when they tell me that, because I can see the guilt just drip off their faces. You know, they feel so much better about themselves when they realize that it's not their fault.
Yes, very well said, Mr. Chet. What are the different types of diabetes?
There are two main types of diabetes. They're called type 1 and type 2. They both cause high blood sugar, which is why they're called diabetes, but they're actually different diseases. With type 1, which is what I have an autoimmune disease. That disease has caused my body to attack the insulin producing cells in the pancreas and kill them off. So I don't produce insulin at all. So I have to take it by injection. Before I go on, let me back up and explain how normal bodies work. This will all make more sense if I do that first. When a non-diabetic person eats food, it gets digested into sugar. Sugar is called glucose. It goes into your bloodstream, and it gets carried throughout your whole body to provide energy for your cells. When your pancreas detects that there is glucose in the blood, it produces a hormone called insulin. Insulin's job is to act as a key that opens the cell walls to allow the glucose to go from the bloodstream into the cell. When the glucose is gone from the bloodstream, the pancreas stops producing insulin, and your blood sugar returns to a normal range. So with normal people, your blood sugar goes higher when you've eaten the food, but before the insulin has allowed it to go into the cells. These fluctuations are natural. But with non-diabetics, they come down to a very low range. So your average blood sugar is very low. Diabetics don't operate that way. As I started to explain, in my case, I can't produce insulin. So I have no choice but to take insulin directly. And the way you do that is through injection. It breaks down indigestion, so you have to take shots or administer it through a pump or some other method. Type 2 is a different disease. That starts with a condition called insulin resistance. What that does is it makes your cells resistant to insulin, which means that your pancreas has to make more and more of it as time goes on to overcome the resistance. It's a progressive thing, so it just keeps getting worse. Eventually, your pancreas loses its capacity to produce insulin. By the time you're diagnosed with prediabetes, you may have lost as much as half of your capacity to make insulin. So from that point on, it becomes your job to keep your pancreas from deteriorating even further. So they're two different diseases, but the treatments for both of them are very similar. In both cases, what we need to do is try to keep the blood sugar from going too high in the first place. And you do that by adjusting the kinds of foods you eat and also by exercising, because by doing moderate physical activity, you will drop your blood sugar just by doing that. So there's a lot to learn about it once you're diagnosed. But those are the two different types.
So, Mr. Chet, what are the common symptoms of diabetes?
The biggest one is constant thirst and urination. When your body detects that excess sugar in your blood, it tries to get rid of it. And it does that by filtering it through the kidneys and expelling it from the body. Before I was diagnosed, I was on a business trip, and I was very thirsty. So I went to a convenience store and I bought some orange juice, and I drank it to quench the thirst. I went into the meeting and I could barely talk. I was so dry, it was hard to speak. Well, that condition went away in a couple of days, and I thought it was strange, but didn't think much of it until I went to a Blue Cross office on business, and there was a pamphlet there that talked about common ailments. One of them was diabetes, and I read that one, and I had all the symptoms except the ones that applied to women. So it was pretty clear that I had diabetes. I went to the doctor, and he diagnosed it right there. So my point in bringing that story up is that by drinking sugar, instead of, if I drank water, that would have helped my kidneys get rid of the glucose that was already in the blood. But instead, I made the situation even worse. I really pounded my system with a lot of sugar, and that's why I couldn't talk, because I was very dehydrated. So that's the first and most common symptoms. If you're urinating a lot and drinking a lot, then that's a big tip off.
Okay, thank you for that tip off, Mr. Chet. So, how can diabetes affect the body? over the long term?
Well, look at it this way. If you take a glass of water and you mix sugar into it, what happens? The water gets sticky. When you've got excess glucose in your blood, that's what you're doing to your blood. You're making it sticky. Now, this goes to every part of your body, and therefore it damages virtually every part of your body in one way or another. One of the big ways is that it causes plaque to build up on your blood vessel walls, so cardiovascular disease results from it. We often find diabetics having toes or feet or legs amputated. The reason for that is that those parts are the furthest from your heart, so the blood pressure is lower. So the effects of the high blood sugar are even greater down there because the blood's not moving as well. Your eyesight can go. People go blind from diabetes because the blood vessels inside the eye get weak and they rupture, and blood seeps into the interior of the eye. Kidney disease happens because of it. I mean, if you think about it, it goes to every part of your body. Virtually everything gets impacted by this in one way or another. So it's a very dangerous disease. And that's another reason I'm doing this, by the way, because I found a lot of diabetics who really don't understand what they're up against. They really don't understand how dangerous this is. And that's a big health problem that we need to address.
Yes, definitely. And how is gestational diabetes different from other types of diabetes?
Well, I don't know a whole lot about gestational diabetes, but I do know that it's generally a temporary condition. It'll happen during pregnancy, but then it'll go away after childbirth. But once you have that, you do have a greater chance of developing type 2 diabetes later on. And that's about all I know about it. I've never actually been pregnant, so
So, Mr. Chet, what lifestyle changes can help manage diabetes effectively?
That's a really good question. There are two main parts of it. One is that you have to understand what foods you're eating are going to raise your blood sugar and which ones won't, because there are foods that fit into both categories. The foods that raise your blood sugar are carbohydrates. Now, this is something people should understand. We think about sugar being the main cause of raising blood sugar, but there are carbohydrates all over the place. They're in breads. Potatoes are very high in carbohydrate. Peas are very high in carbohydrate. When you eat carbohydrate, when it gets digested, 1 gram of carbohydrate gets digested into 1 gram of sugar. So it's really the same thing. It's not like you can look at your piece of bread and say, well, that's really not high in sugar. Actually, it's very high in sugar. It just hasn't gotten digested yet. So you need to be aware of what you're eating. One of the things that makes diabetes so complicated is that there are all kinds of people giving advice to diabetics, and it gets confusing. If you Google diabetes and diet, you'll come up with, here are 3 foods you should always eat. Here are 7 foods you should avoid. Here's a drink that's going to solve your problem. There are all these recommendations that just make things confusing. What I explain to people is that the only carbohydrates that you really need to worry about are the ones that you're actually eating. So the idea is to take a look at what you're consuming and figure out where the carbohydrates are coming from. Most of us have pretty regular diets. Our breakfasts are pretty much the same. Lunches are pretty much the same. Dinners will vary, but over the course of a month, you'll repeat those recipes too. So the number of foods each one of us really eats isn't all that great. So what I tell people is, when you have food, take a look at your plate and ask yourself, where are the carbohydrates coming from? If you've got a piece of bread or a potato, that's going to be high in carbohydrate. If you've got meat or fish or chicken on the plate, that's protein, and that won't raise your blood sugar at all. So once you identify what these foods are and what they do, you can modify your diet. You can eat more of the things that won't raise your blood sugar, and you can still have the carbohydrates, but you just don't want to overload on them. So that's probably the key lifestyle change. The other thing that gets short shrift is exercise. A researcher at the Joslin Diabetes Center called it the magic bullet. And the reason he said that is that moderate exercise, and by that I mean just everyday movements, whether it's walking up the stairs, shopping, playing with your kids, just anything that gets your body moving will help to lower your blood sugar. The reason for that is that when you're moving, your muscles are either burning the glucose that's in the blood, so it's getting rid of it that way, or it's storing it, because your muscle will actually take on excess sugar and store it for future use. So those are the two main changes. We have, we get a lot of advertising for pharmaceuticals, and they certainly help. But with every single one of those pharmaceuticals, they all recommend diet and exercise. In fact, it's not just a recommendation, it's that this medication works in conjunction with diet and exercise for exactly the reasons I told you. If you're taking a medication, you're taking the same amount every day, more than likely. Some of them are once a week. But the point is that whatever the medication is, there's a baseline there that's not going to change. You've got X amount of medication. Now, if you blast your body with a lot of glucose, the medication is not going to be as effective. So even though you're taking the medication, you still have to watch your diet and do the moderate physical activity.
Very well said, Mr. Chet. So, how important is diet in managing diabetes?
It's critical. It's absolutely critical. I had when I was running my company, I had a guy that he was an employee, and I had known this guy for a long time. Probably knew him for 30 years. And I ran into him on the telephone a few years ago. And it turned out that he had gotten type 2 diabetes, and he didn't take care of it, meaning that he was eating a lot of high-carb foods, and he wasn't paying attention at all to his diabetic condition. He told me that after a while, he couldn't take the pain in his legs anymore, so he went to the hospital, and they took one leg off on one day and the other one off on the next. He died a couple of years later from complications of diabetes. So, he's a good example of what happens when you don't watch your diet. You wind up eating a lot of high-carb foods because they taste good. That's the thing about carbs. They taste great, so people typically eat a lot of them. So that's why it's critical.
Definitely. So, what kinds of foods should I avoided or limited in diabetic diet?
Well, the carbohydrates are really what you have to watch. Carbohydrates are all over the place, and foods aren't all the same. Some are high in carbohydrates, others are lower. What you can do is there are books that will tell you how much carbohydrate is in a given food. You can Google it. If you Google, how many carbs are in an ear of corn, it'll give you that answer. So it's pretty easy to get the information. Actually, this is kind of funny. What you can also do is ask Alexa or Siri. Do you have Siri there in your room?
Yes.
Okay. Well, what I've done in the past is said, Siri, how many carbs in an ear of corn? And Siri will hear it, and she'll tell you what it is. You can hear it in the background if the host has Siri on. So that's the first step. Look at your plate. If you don't know what's got carbs and what doesn't, just ask Siri or Alexa, and they'll tell you. And it'll tell you foods that have a lot of carbs, but it'll also tell you foods that don't have a lot of carbs. And if you can focus on eating those low-carb foods, you're going to be much better off. For example, salads, leafy vegetables don't have very many carbs at all. A lot of vegetables don't. Eggs don't. If you want to make yourself a chef salad with a hard-boiled egg, the eggs are all protein. So, you have to understand what's going on.
Definitely. You need to understand.
Yeah, in fact, a guy, Dr. Elliot Jocelyn, was a diabetes pioneer. He started treating diabetics early in the 20th century before we had discovered insulin. And all he could do was make his patients comfortable and then watch them die because it was a fatal disease that they could do nothing about. Once insulin became available in 1925, he started using it with his patients, and all of a sudden his patients could live. And that was just an amazing thing. Well, one of the things that Dr. Jocelyn said that is absolutely true is the diabetic who knows the most lives the longest. The more you know about your food intake, the more you understand about exercise, the more you understand about how your medications work, the better your control is going to be and the longer you will live. But you do have to learn about it. You can't just take a pill and go on autopilot. It doesn't work that way.
Yes, certainly. So, how does exercise influence blood sugar levels?
What it does is well, number one, it impacts the complications because just by keeping your blood flowing, it helps prevent plaque buildup in your blood vessels. If you look at it this way, if you have a pipe, just a regular pipe that's transporting water, if the pipe is clean, the water charges through. It's got a good solid flow. If you have the pipe built up with sediment on the inside, the flow slows down. And the result is that because it's slowing down, the plaque will build up even faster. So there's that aspect of it. But the other is that with the muscle does burn glucose directly. You go for a brisk walk, and you will find your blood sugar dropping. I know this for a fact because I do it myself. If your blood sugar is high, the exercise is the way to go. Especially since when the muscle is at rest, it'll absorb that glucose from your bloodstream and store it too. Either way, it goes from your blood into another tissue of the body where it's not going to impact you.
Definitely. What are the recommended blood sugar levels for someone with diabetes?
Well, we have the normal blood sugar fluctuates, as I mentioned earlier. The normal blood sugar is from 70 to 130. Although, depending on what you eat, even with a non-diabetic, it can be higher temporarily. But with non-diabetics, the insulin will bring it back down. With diabetics, it's very hard to get to that normal level. In fact, in my experience, it's just about impossible. You'll get there temporarily, but it's awfully hard to maintain it. With diabetics, they tell you that if you're in the mid 150s, that's good control. You're higher than normal, but we can tolerate that for the most part. So that's what our goal is. There's another measure, which is really the critical measure of how your blood sugar control's been. It's called the hemoglobin A1C, and it measures your average blood glucose level for the previous 3 months. That level, they tell you if it's 7.0 or less, that's excellent control. In my case, it's typically around 6.9, so I'm doing pretty well in that department. The A1C is really critical, though, because your temporary blood sugar, your blood sugars fluctuate during the day, even for non-diabetics as well as diabetics. So you can take a blood test at a moment in time, but it doesn't reflect your overall control. It's important to know what the overall is because the damage isn't done by temporary high blood sugars. It's done by average high blood sugars. So if your A1C is showing that your blood sugar is in good control over 2 or 3 months, then you're probably going to be in good shape as far as avoiding complications go. Some people really freak out when they realize their blood sugar is higher than normal. And I guess that's a natural response, but the fact is that you don't have to have higher than normal blood sugars. You can do very well with moderately high blood sugars.
Yes, very well said, Mr. Chet. What are the potential complications of uncontrolled diabetes?
Death is one of them. When you have an amputation, that's an indication of how much damage has been done to your body throughout. Damage didn't just happen to your toes or legs. It's been damaging your kidneys, your circulatory system, everything. So, diabetes damage doesn't happen all of a sudden. You don't all of a sudden die from diabetes. It picks you apart a little bit at a time. It might start with the toes. It might go to the feet. You might start having kidney failure. You might start having cardiovascular problems. You might have a heart attack. You might have a clot that will cause a stroke. I mean, there are just a whole lot of complications to this. Because, if you want to get back to what I said a while ago about the sugar in the water, I mean, you're letting that sticky blood flow through your system, and do damage over a long period of time. It's just a question of what goes first.
Yes, definitely. Very well said, Mr. Chet. So, what are the potential complications of uncontrolled diabetes?
Well, those are the things I just listed off. Those are the things that'll happen.
Yes, for sure. So, what new technologies are available to help manage diabetes?
That is a really good question. Let me back up and give you a little bit of history. When I was diagnosed in 1981, the only way that I could know whether my blood sugars were good or bad was to use this material called test tape. It was a yellow paper that came in a dispenser that looked like a tape measure. What you would do is tear off a 2 or 3 inch piece of this thing, and you would dip it into a urine sample. And if the tape stayed yellow, it meant your blood sugar was low. But it would turn various shades of green right down to black if the sugar was high. So that would indicate as to where your blood sugar was. But the key word is was, because that urine was produced an hour earlier. It didn't tell you what your blood sugar was right at that moment. So it wasn't really great, real-time information. In the 1980s, we had the access to personal blood glucose monitors. And these were a huge improvement. You could take a small drop of blood from a fingertip and analyze it yourself whenever you wanted to. And that would tell you exactly what your blood sugar was right at that moment. So that was a huge improvement. Our control was much better having that information. Well, if you fast forward to today, now we've got continual glucose monitors. I use one myself. You insert it under your skin every 10 days, and it will radio your blood sugar to a receiver. So that in my case, all I have to do is pull the receiver out of my pocket and look at it, and it'll tell me any time of day what my blood sugar is. You don't have to do a finger stick. There's no blood sample required. All you do is reach into your pocket and pull it out. So this is a huge improvement. It really gives you the information you need to control your diabetes well. And that's why it's such a crime. If people don't learn about their disease and take care of it, they'll die just like people did for thousands of years. But now you've got this technology that can literally save your life once you learn how to use it. And, think about your family and friends. I mean, you're going to die unnecessarily. But you have the tools, and that's the important thing. That's another important thing that I've got to get out there. People have to understand that this is not a death sentence. Many people think that. They just figure, I've got diabetes, my grandfather died of it, and grandma died of it, and I'm going to die of it too. You can't think that way. Things have changed so much, even over the last 10 or 15 years, that is not necessarily the case at all.
So, Mr. Chet, is it diabetes is hereditary?
There are genes that do cause it. The University of Massachusetts completed a study recently where they identified 117 genes that are related to type 2 diabetes. And, they're out there. They're out there in certain populations more than others. Black people, Hispanics, Pacific Islanders, Asian Americans, and Native Americans all have a genetic predisposition toward getting type 2 diabetes. It's not their fault. It's just the way the genes fall. In my case, Northern Europeans are more prone to type 1 diabetes, which is what I have. Well, my heritage is Polish, German, and English. So that works in my case. My heritage worked against me as far as the genetics go. So, there are certain groups of people that are more prone to one or the other type of diabetes.
Yes, definitely. Very well said, Mr. Chet. But before we go on, I want to shout out my listeners in, where is it? In Switzerland. Thank you, Switzerland, for supporting this podcast, because in VOD, I got 40% out and share. Zurich at 31, Arago at 6, Geneva 4, Lucerne, Bern, Schaffhausen, Ticino, and a lot more. Thank you, Switzerland, for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower, well, writers all over the world. What do insulin pumps work, and who might benefit from using one?
The insulin pump is a more efficient way of delivering insulin than individual injections. The pump port, which is something that you put under your skin, lasts for about 3 days, and your pump will deliver insulin anytime you tell it to. So if I check my CGM and find my blood sugar is high, I can pull out my pump and tell my pump to deliver like 5 units of insulin or whatever I need. So here again, it's a wonderful improvement, because it used to be that you would find someplace private where you could give yourself that injection. Now, people might think you're checking your cell phone when you pull it out of the pocket, when what you're really doing is giving yourself an insulin bolus.
Definitely.
So that's another marvelous improvement.
Yes. So how can diabetes impact mental health?
I'm not an expert in that, but I can tell you that there's something called diabetes burnout, where people get stressed out about diabetes, they get tired of dealing with it, and they stop doing it. There's also the underlying stress that you have got this disease, and it's very dangerous, and it's hard to control. So there's a level of frustration there that I'm sure, has to affect people's mental health. I guess I'm fortunate. I tend to take things in stride, and I do that with diabetes too. I don't let temporary high blood sugars bother me. I just fix them and move on with life. And that's really the attitude you have to have. Because if you're going to really fret about temporary high blood sugars, you're going to spend a lot of time being aggravated, because they're unavoidable. So I think, given your individual personality, that this could really be a damaging thing mentally. Whether it's connected to Alzheimer's or dementia or anything like that, I really don't know. But the underlying things that I just talked about, they definitely exist.
Very well said, Mr. Chet. So if you compare diabetes to age, is it the same status?
I don't know much about age, but I would say no. If only because diabetes is a disease that requires continual monitoring and continual adjustment. With AIDS, I like I said, I don't know, but my take on it is that you take certain medications and it keeps that repressed. So in that case, it would just be the medication that would do the job. And in diabetes, it doesn't. The medication helps, but it doesn't do the entire process.
What resources are available for people newly diagnosed with diabetes?
Well, I'm not an expert in that either. I know there are health clinics that you can go to, depending on what kind of health insurance you have. If you have health insurance, you should be able to go to a general practitioner or an endocrinologist, which the endocrinologist would really be the best bet. But you can go to any kind of clinic, and they'd be able to do an A1C to tell you what your blood glucose level is, and they can also provide some advice. However, one of the problems is that medical people don't have enough time to really spend with people the way they used to. You go to the doctor, you might spend 15 minutes with him or her, but you'll spend about half that time with the doctor being on the computer and asking routine questions that aren't related to diabetes. For that reason, most diabetics don't understand the basics of the disease. Some of the things that I've already explained to you about how type 2 starts, how type 1 starts, doctors don't have time to explain that to patients. They'll prescribe the medication and tell them, certain things like avoiding sugar. But the diabetic doesn't really get enough information to really understand what they're up against. And that's where my books and videos come in. They explain that stuff in everyday language, especially the videos. The videos are less than a half an hour long, so you can get a pretty good background on diabetes just by watching those. And my dream is that people will show those videos in groups, because if you have an hour-long meeting and you watch the video for the first half hour and then discuss it for the second half hour, that's a powerful thing, because what I have found is that everybody has a story about diabetes in one way or another. Either they have it, or a relative has it, or they know somebody who has it, or they've heard stories about it. So you get some pretty lively discussions that reinforce what is in the videos. So I would suggest that people get those. There's a nominal charge to buy or rent the videos. I wish I could give them away, but I've had expenses doing this. They're not expensive. If they could go to my website, which is challengediabetes.us, they'll find them there. And I would highly recommend, especially for somebody who is newly diabetic, that they have a look at this.
What advancements have been made in the treatment of diabetes in recent years?
Well, the things we talked about, the continual glucose monitor and the pump, those are huge improvements, huge. And they've been a dream for years and years, but only recently were they able to come up with the algorithms that allowed the CGM to work. And the algorithms are just getting better all the time. So we've made great progress, and we're making even more progress as time goes on.
Very well said, Mr. Chet. And can you please invite our listeners to buy your book, The Diabetes Book, What Everyone Should Know?
Please have a look at the book. Actually, there are two books. One is an upgraded version of the original book that you see on the screen. And really, what I said about the videos, that is a game changer. If you could show them to your religious group or civic group, or if you have a book club, to be any kind of group that you have, if you could make this an event for one hour meeting, it could really be powerful. And that's really what I'm trying to achieve here.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Chet Lagasca, because if you support him, more diabetes books to come. So, Mr. Chet, thank you for your time.
All right, thank you.
Bodyguard people, see you soon.